What was it like on the set of Little House on the Prairie? The actress who played Michael Landon's wife says it wasn't as wholesome as it seemed.
Guess what me and Andrew found? Where have you been, young lady? You're late. Huh? I asked you where you've been. Well, I was trying to tell you, me and Andrew. Fact is, you're late.
For 9 seasons, Little House on the Prairie convinced American audiences that life on the 1870s frontier was wholesome, difficult, and ultimately beautiful. Families gathered around their television sets to watch the Ingalls family push through poverty, sickness, and every hardship the prairie could throw at them, always coming out the other side a little wiser and a little closer. It was comfort television before anyone used that phrase, a show engineered to make you believe in decency again. But behind the wagon wheels, the calico dresses, and the golden Minnesota sunsets, the Rayall production told a much messier story. The cast fought, drank, fell in love, fell out of love, and carried private struggles that never made it into the closing credits. So let's step off the set for a while and look at what the cameras weren't supposed to catch. On screen, Laura Ingalls and Nellie Oleson were built to despise each other. Nellie was the spoiled, sharp-tongued daughter of the town's wealthiest family, and Laura was the scrappy farm girl who never let her get away with anything. Audiences ate it up for years, cheering every time Laura got the better of her rival. What most viewers never guessed was that Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura, and Allison Arngrim, who played Nellie, were genuinely close off camera. The two girls spent their downtime together, visited each other's homes, and by most accounts got along better than almost anyone else in the young cast. Arngrim has talked for years about how strange it felt to be despised by an entire generation of TV viewers for a character she built with her best friend. That friendship extended into some fairly mischievous territory once Nellie was married off to Percival Dalton, played by actor Steve Tracy. The show leaned hard into their on-screen chemistry, giving the newlyweds plenty of affectionate, occasionally over-the-top moments in front of the cameras. The irony is that Tracy, who Arngrim also considered a close friend, was gay in real life, so the entire romantic pairing existed purely as a performance. By several accounts, the two actors turned their fake marriage into an inside joke, hamming up their on-camera affection specifically to fluster Melissa Gilbert, who was still a teenager filming her own far more restrained romantic scenes as Laura. It's a strange little detail that captures something true about a family show. The adults were having their own kind of fun just out of frame. If you picture the Little House set as some kind of pioneer-themed Sunday school, you're going to be disappointed. Melissa Gilbert wrote candidly in her memoir, Prairie Tale, about just how much alcohol moved through the production, describing a crew culture where beer was a constant presence during the workday, especially on the long, grueling shoot days out in the California heat standing in for the Minnesota Prairie. She specifically pointed to Michael Landon, the show's star, director, and guiding creative force, as someone who was drinking far more than most people around him realized. According to her account, Landon would start his mornings with coffee that had been quietly spiked, and he kept a steady flow going for the rest of the day without most of the cast or crew catching on. It wasn't until years later, largely through Gilbert's own writing, that the scope of it became public knowledge. For a show built entirely around wholesome family values, it's a jarring contrast, and it says something about how skilled Landon was at compartmentalizing his personal struggles while still running one of the most demanding productions on network television. Michael Landon spent 8 seasons playing Charles Ingalls, a devout, hard-working, endlessly patient father who leaned on his faith through every crisis Walnut Grove threw at him. It's one of the most recognizable father figures in American television history. What a lot of longtime fans never clocked is that Landon himself was Jewish, the son of a Jewish father, Eli Maurice Orowitz, and an Irish Catholic mother, Peggy O'Neill. He was born Eugene Maurice Orowitz in Forest Hills, Queens, in 1936, and the family later moved to Collingswood, New Jersey, where young Eugene was raised with a strong connection to his father's heritage, celebrating his bar mitzvah at a synagogue in a town that hadn't allowed Jewish families to live there until after the Second World War. He didn't see any contradiction between his own identity and the deeply Christian character he was playing, and later in his career he reportedly grew more open about that side of himself with people he trusted on set, including at least one writer whose Jewish-themed script for the show he championed personally. Landon carried a difficult childhood into his adult life as well. He wrote and spoke about his mother's struggles with her mental health, including a frightening incident during a family vacation when he stepped in to save her, and about the stress that childhood left behind. None of that made it into Little House. But it's not hard to see why a man who grew up needing to be the strong one in his own household might have been drawn to playing a father who always held things together. Michael Landon's thick, curling dark hair became almost as iconic as the character he played, but it wasn't the gift of nature that it looked like on screen. Landon dyed his hair for years to maintain that rich, camera-ready color, and he treated the process seriously enough to rely on a professional colorist rather than leaving it to chance. The tricky part was that studio lighting combined with natural sunlight on location shoots had a habit of pulling strange, faintly purplish tones out of the dye once gray started creeping in underneath. It became enough of a recurring headache that the production reportedly brought in additional colorists specifically to keep his look consistent from episode to episode, a small but telling reminder of how much invisible labor went into maintaining the show's carefully wholesome image. It's easy to remember Little House on the Prairie as gentle, feel-good television, and in a lot of ways it was. But the show also had a habit of walking directly into subjects that most family programming of the era wouldn't touch. Across its run, storylines dealt with sexual assault, addiction, racism, disability, and the complicated realities of adoption, often without softening the material into an easy lesson. This was still the 1970s and early 80s, a period when television was only beginning to test how far it could push social and political boundaries in front of a mainstream audience. For a show set in the horse and buggy past, Little House was frequently doing something quietly ahead of its time in the present, using its historical setting as cover to talk about issues that plenty of contemporary dramas were still avoiding. Willie Olson, Nellie's mischievous little brother, was played by Jonathan Gilbert, and the connection to Melissa Gilbert wasn't a coincidence of casting. The two were, in fact, siblings in real life, though through adoption rather than blood. For years they grew up together both at home and on set, but according to Melissa Gilbert's own later writing, the closeness they shared as children didn't survive into adulthood, and the siblings eventually became estranged. Jonathan Gilbert stepped away from acting once the show wrapped and built an entirely different career for himself as a stockbroker in New York, about as far from Walnut Grove as a person can get. Melissa, meanwhile, stayed in the public eye. She kept acting for decades, served a term as president of the Screen Actors Guild in the early 2000s, and in 2016 even ran as the presumptive Democratic nominee for a congressional seat in Michigan, a campaign she was ultimately forced to abandon due to lingering injuries from an earlier accident. Two kids who grew up under the same roof and the same studio lights ended up living about as differently as two people can. If the Laura and Nellie friendship is the show's feel-good behind-the-scenes story, the relationship between Melissa Gilbert and Melissa Sue Anderson, who played older sister Mary Ingalls, is the opposite. On screen, the two were devoted sisters. Off-screen, by most accounts including Gilbert's own, the two young actresses simply did not get along, and whatever tension existed between them never really eased over the 9 years they worked together. Gilbert later described her co-star as cold and difficult to connect with in her memoir, though it's worth noting that's only one side of the story. Anderson has generally kept a lower public profile and hasn't offered her own detailed account of what went wrong. Other cast members reportedly found Anderson distant as well, and some have speculated that a strict, protective upbringing might have shaped how comfortable she felt building casual friendships on set. Whatever the real cause, it's a reminder that a show can sell a beautiful sisterly bond to millions of viewers while the two actors delivering those lines are barely speaking to each other between takes. It's easy to assume Walnut Grove was purely a studio invention, but the town genuinely exists. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the original semi-autobiographical book series the show was adapted from, actually spent part of her childhood there. The real Walnut Grove sits in Redwood County, Minnesota, founded in 1874 and formally incorporated in 1879, which places its early history right alongside the fictional timeline the show was portraying. It's a genuinely small town, with a population that has hovered around 600 or 700 people in recent decades and a land area of roughly a single square mile. Wilder drew on several different real locations from her childhood for her books, not just Walnut Grove, but the town leaned into its connection to the story long after the show ended, and it remains something of a pilgrimage site for devoted fans of both the books and the series. The broader story behind Little House is really the story of American homesteading. Laura Ingalls Wilder was born in the upper Midwest in the late 1860s and spent much of her childhood moving with her family as they tried to build a life on the frontier, including a stretch in Kansas when she was very young. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had brought a massive stretch of that land under American control decades earlier, but most of it remained unmapped and unsettled by American families for a long time afterward. The federal government actively encouraged people to move west and build self-sufficient homesteads, growing their own food and building their own homes from scratch, and it painted that lifestyle as noble and even romantic. In practice, it was often brutally hard, and Wilder's own family experienced plenty of that hardship firsthand. Those experiences eventually became the raw material for her book series decades later, and that series became popular enough that a producer named Ed Friendly saw an opportunity to bring it to television. Once he secured the rights, the show moved into production relatively quickly, premiering in September of 1974 and running for 8 seasons before wrapping up in the spring of 1982. A follow-up season under a slightly different title continued the story for one more year afterward. The bond between Michael Landon and Melissa Gilbert is one of the more emotionally complicated relationships to come out of the production. Gilbert lost her adoptive father when she was still a child and has written about how that loss left a real void in her life. Once she was cast as Laura, she found herself drawn to Landon as something like the father figure she'd been missing, and by her own account he embraced that role, telling her directly that he loved her like a daughter. The two became close off camera as well, sharing plenty of playful moments when the cameras weren't rolling. That closeness didn't survive unscathed, though. When Landon left his second wife for a relationship with a makeup artist on the production named Cindy Clerico, it landed hard for Gilbert, whose own parents had divorced when she was young. She has described feeling genuinely betrayed by the decision and pulling away from him entirely for a period of time. Eventually, though, when Landon was diagnosed with a pancreatic cancer that would ultimately take his life, Gilbert made peace with him before he passed away in 1991. She later named one of her own children after him, a small but telling gesture toward a relationship that meant a great deal to her even after everything that happened in between. Melissa Gilbert was only 15 when she had to film her first on-screen kiss as Laura Ingalls opposite Dean Butler, who played Almanzo Wilder and was in his early 20s at the time. It was also, by her own account, essentially her first real kiss of any kind, which made an already awkward moment even more uncomfortable given the age gap between the two actors. Unsure how to handle it, she turned to Landon, who was not only her closest ally on set but also directing many of the show's episodes. He took her discomfort seriously enough to raise it with the producers, and the scene was ultimately adjusted so the two characters shared a simple kiss on the cheek instead of anything more romantic. It's a small production decision, but it says something about how much influence Landon had over the show's day-to-day choices, and how willing he was to use that influence to protect a young actress he genuinely cared about. Not every actor on set was quite as protective of Gilbert's feelings, though most of it came from a place of genuine affection rather than cruelty. Alison Arngrim, already established as one of Gilbert's closest friends on the show, and her on-screen husband Steve Tracy took a particular delight in exaggerating their fake marriage specifically to fluster their younger, more inexperienced co-star. Since Tracy was gay and had no real romantic interest in Arngrim at all, the whole dynamic was purely theatrical, which made it easy for the two of them to play it up as broadly as they wanted without any real stakes attached. For Gilbert, still working through the nerves of her first real on-screen romance, watching her two friends turn their pretend marriage into a running joke at her expense was probably equal parts embarrassing and, in hindsight, pretty funny. Beyond the drinking and the family drama, Landon had a well-documented reputation as one of the biggest jokers on set. Gilbert and Arngrim both picked up some of his mischievous instincts over the years, at one point rigging a bathroom with plastic wrap as a prank on their fellow cast members. Landon apparently ran his own long game as well. Rachel Greenbush, who played the youngest Ingalls' daughter, Carrie, later described him as a committed practical joker in her own recollections of the production. She and Melissa Gilbert would sometimes catch frogs down at a nearby creek during breaks in filming and bring them back to hand off to Landon, who would then, to everyone's horror, casually pop the frog into his own mouth before approaching an unsuspecting cast or crew member with a big grin, opening his mouth, and letting the very much alive frog spring back out to send people scattering. It's a strange, slightly gross image to put next to the buttoned-up patriarch of Walnut Grove, but it fits with everything else people who worked with Landon have said about his sense of humor. Watch closely enough, and the show gives up a handful of genuinely funny production slip-ups. One of the most talked about among longtime fans is the sheer inconsistency of Laura's fictional pregnancy timeline, which stretched on screen for well over a year according to fans and researchers who have mapped out the show's internal chronology, first announced in one season and somehow still ongoing by the following summer. There's also a genuinely bizarre historical mismatch buried in a Season 8 episode centered on a restaurant franchising storyline, which features a character clearly modeled on Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame, decades before the real Colonel Sanders was even born and well over half a century before his fried chicken company actually existed. Given that the show is supposed to be set in the 1870s and 1880s, it's a wonderfully odd anachronism to have slipped through. There's also a fairly obvious stunt mishap tucked into a Season 5 episode built around a dramatic attempted attack on a moving train. In the middle of the tense sequence, sharp-eyed viewers can spot what is unmistakably a dummy being thrown from the train instead of a person, landing in the grass with none of the momentum a real body would carry, while the actual stunt performer can be seen rolling down a nearby hill completely unbothered, having clearly overtaken the stationary prop that was supposed to represent the same fall. A handful of smaller continuity issues have become minor legends among devoted fans. In at least a couple of episodes, keen viewers have noticed tree branches rustling and creaking outside an upstairs window that, in every other shot of the house, simply doesn't have a tree anywhere nearby, almost certainly the result of reused sound effects or stock footage layered in for atmosphere. There's also a family quilt that seems to travel around the Walnut Grove universe with a mind of its own, showing up on different beds belonging to different families across multiple episodes, a telling sign that the wardrobe and prop departments were reusing pieces wherever they could to stretch a limited budget. Costuming brought its own set of anachronisms as well, which is a fairly common issue for period productions of any era. Some of the women's hairstyles lean far closer to a 1970s perm than anything that would have existed on the actual 1880s prairie, and Melissa Gilbert has openly acknowledged in later interviews that her own hair was often noticeably too long and too modern-looking for the period. There's also at least one recurring wardrobe choice for Caroline Ingalls that includes an item of clothing that wouldn't be invented for decades after the show's setting. Fans have also spent years puzzling over a genuine narrative contradiction involving Albert, the Ingalls' adopted son, whose fate seems to shift depending on which piece of the extended Little House story you're watching, with one version suggesting he died young and another describing him growing into the town's adult doctor. It became enough of a running point of confusion that Melissa Gilbert was once asked to settle it directly for a fan, and rather than trying to reconcile the two timelines seriously, she leaned into the absurdity of it, joking that the character had simply come back from the dead to keep serving the town as Walnut Grove's undead physician. It's not an official explanation by any stretch, but it's become a fond piece of fan folklore all the same. The show's final television movie, centered on the town's eventual destruction, is set in 1901, well over a decade after the events of the last regular season. Logically, that means most of the adult characters should have visibly aged into their 60s, and the children still on screen in earlier seasons should have grown into full adults by that point. Instead, the cast looks essentially unchanged, creating a strange sense that time simply stopped moving for Walnut Grove even as the calendar kept advancing around it. What happened to the cast once the cameras stopped rolling for good tells its own quiet story about how differently a show like this can shape the rest of someone's life. Karen Grassel, who played matriarch Caroline Ingalls, continued acting in film and television for years afterward and has stayed connected to the industry, though none of her later roles ever reached the same level of recognition as her time on Little House. Melissa Gilbert kept working steadily as an actress for decades, moved into industry leadership through her time at the Screen Actors Guild, and eventually made a serious, if ultimately unsuccessful, run at elected office. Michael Landon, meanwhile, went on to create and star in another long-running family drama, Highway to Heaven, before his death from pancreatic cancer in 1991 at the age of 54. He left behind 9 children, reportedly taking care to divide his estate evenly among them in an effort to head off any conflict after he was gone. His son, Michael Landon Jr., went on to build his own respected career as a producer and director, carrying a version of the family business forward into a new generation. None of this behind-the-scenes messiness actually undoes what Little House on the Prairie accomplished. If anything, it makes the show a little more human. A cast of actors who genuinely disliked each other still managed to build believable family bonds in front of the camera. A star quietly struggling with his own drinking still delivered a performance millions of people still cite as their model of a good father. A production willing to fudge its own historical timeline still found the nerve to tackle subjects most family shows of the era wouldn't go near. Decades later, people are still watching, still noticing the tree branches that shouldn't be there and the quilt that keeps changing beds, still arguing about whether Albert really came back as a zombie doctor. That's usually the sign of a show that did something right, even if the version we remember was never quite as tidy behind the scenes as it looked on screen. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this look behind the curtain of Walnut Grove, stick around for more deep dives into the shows that shaped a generation of television.